Every dog carries harmful genetic variants. Humans do too. And perhaps surprisingly, large genetic studies have found that mixed-breed dogs are often more likely to carry one or more of the known disease variants we currently test for. So why do some purebred dog breeds develop certain inherited diseases more often than their mixed-breed counterparts? The answer lies in understanding population genetics, the hidden forces that shape which variants spread, which disappear, and which become concentrated over generations. In this episode, we will explore those forces and begin to understand how founder effects, genetic drift, inbreeding, selection, and popular sires have shaped modern dog populations. And before we get into the more complicated concepts, we first need to understand what genetic diversity actually is. Put simply, genetic diversity is the variety of genetic differences that exist within a population. The more genetic diversity a population has, the better equipped it is to stay healthy over time. Harmful recessive variants are less likely to pair up and cause disease, and problems linked to inbreeding, such as reduced fertility, smaller litters, and lower puppy survival, are less likely to become widespread. Genetic diversity also gives the population more options to respond to future challenges, such as a new infectious disease. We'll also look at two of the biggest forces that reduce that diversity in dogs: inbreeding and the overuse of popular sires. In genetics, inbreeding doesn't simply mean breeding close relatives. It occurs whenever the same stretch of DNA is inherited through both sides of a dog's pedigree from a shared ancestor, even if that ancestor lived many generations ago. Imagine a dog carrying the A allele. He passes it to two different offspring. Over generations, both family lines continue independently. But if those lines eventually reconnect through a mating, that same ancestral copy of DNA can come back together in a single puppy. Because both copies originated from the very same ancestor, we call them identical by descent. Most of the time, inheriting the same stretch of DNA from both parents causes no obvious problem. Breeders sometimes use related dogs to make traits more consistent and predictable. But if that shared stretch of DNA includes a harmful recessive mutation, inheriting two copies can cause disease. And when we think about a pedigree back to the founding ancestors of a breed, the math explodes fast. Two parents become 4 grandparents, then 8 great-grandparents, and by 10 generations you're looking at 1,024 pedigree slots. But in a real purebred pedigree, many of those ancestral slots are occupied by the same influential dogs and popular sires over and over again. As a result, the number of truly unique ancestors across is far smaller than 2046, increasing the likelihood that descendants inherit the same stretches of DNA from both sides of the pedigree. In fact, the pedigrees of many top-winning dogs contain surprisingly few unique ancestors. Generation after generation, the same influential sires are used in the hope of reproducing exceptional qualities, concentrating their genetics throughout the population. This raises a much larger question. If concentrating the gene pool around famous winners makes litters more consistent and often easier to reproduce than through a less related pairing, does that encourage breeders to keep increasing the genetic contribution of those same popular dogs generation after generation? Over time, that can create entire chains of popular sires, each building on the last, progressively narrowing the gene pool further and further. What will breeds look like 50 or 100 years from now? How much diversity can be lost before the population reaches a point where recovery becomes difficult, or even impossible? These are all important questions that breed communities need to consider. And to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning of modern dog breeds. Most breeds were built from a relatively small group of founders, chosen because they excelled at something people valued, such as herding livestock, hunting game, pulling sleds, guarding property, or simply fitting a very specific ideal look. Once the registry closed, breeders were working inside that same genetic circle. So with each generation, the same ancestors showed up in more places, and the overlap kept building. When a breed begins, it doesn't carry the full genetic range that existed before. It starts with only the DNA carried by that small founding group, so rare variants outside that slice are gone from the breed from day one. And after that, chance keeps reshaping the deck. Even without anyone selecting for a trait, random drift can make one variant spread through the breed while another quietly disappears just because fewer dogs happen to pass it on. And the smaller the breeding population, the more quickly genetic diversity is lost through random chance. This process is called genetic drift. And the rate is predictable. So, for example, if a breed started with 100 unrelated dogs, we would expect to lose 0.5% diversity every generation through drift alone, and that loss compounds quickly. After 10 generations, about 95% remains. After 20, 90% remains. After 50, 78% remains. After 100 generations, 61% remains, and that is the expected loss from genetic drift alone. Add line breeding, unequal family sizes, or the repeated use of popular sires, and diversity can disappear much faster. Put simply, the smaller the breeding population, the faster diversity disappears. So when a breed begins with only a small number of dogs, and only a small fraction of the population continues to reproduce each generation, random chance begins to play a much larger role in shaping the breed's gene pool. Some harmful variants become more common simply by chance, while other variants are lost entirely, even when they might have been beneficial. Breeders can select against known harmful variants, but selection alone can't overcome the effects of a small gene pool. If we remove too many dogs from breeding, fewer families pass their genes to the next generation, and genetic diversity disappears even faster. As the population becomes more and more closely related, the harmful recessive variants that remain are more likely to pair together and cause disease. Add the repeated use of popular sires, and a breed's gene pool can narrow far more quickly than most people realize. As diversity decreases, more genes become homozygous, which means a dog is more likely to inherit two matching copies of the same DNA variant. That helps make breed traits look more consistent, but it also means a harmful recessive variant is more likely to meet its matching copy and show up in the dog. And this pattern appears clearly in a recent study of more than 100,000 dogs. While mixed-breed dogs were 1.6 times more likely to be carriers of common recessive disease variants, purebred dogs, which tend to have lower diversity, were 2.7 times more likely to inherit two copies of the same recessive variant and therefore be genetically affected. So the takeaway is that mixed-breed dogs carried more of the known disease variants, but purebred dogs were much more likely to develop recessive genetic diseases because they inherited two copies of the same mutation. And that likely explains why purebred dogs were more likely to have certain genetic diseases in this study too. A landmark 2013 study examined veterinary records for more than 90,000 dogs. Of these, 27,254 had been diagnosed with at least one of 24 disorders considered to have an inherited component. For 13 of the 24 disorders, including hip dysplasia and several cancers, there was no significant difference between purebred and mixed-breed dogs. But 10 disorders were significantly more common in purebred dogs, including cataracts, epilepsy, and dilated cardiomyopathy. Only one disorder, cranial cruciate ligament rupture, was significantly more common in mixed-breed dogs. So the study showed two important things. Many disorders commonly associated with purebred dogs occurred just as often in mixed-breed dogs, but purebred dogs had a higher risk for some of the inherited conditions. From a population genetics perspective, that's exactly what we'd expect. As genetic diversity declines and the same bloodlines are used repeatedly, some harmful variants carried by those concentrated ancestors can become more common, and offspring are more likely to inherit two copies of the same recessive mutation. That's when inherited genetic diseases begin to appear more frequently. So far, we've focused mostly on inherited disease, but genetic stewardship is about much more than preventing disease. It's also about preserving the distinct genetic lineages that give each breed its predictable temperament, behavior, structure, and working abilities, helping ensure that future generations of dogs remain well-suited to the different lifestyles, jobs, and roles for which they were developed. That's why preserving healthy, purebred populations matters. So when we talk about what responsible genetic stewardship looks like, this is what we mean. Testing what we can, preserving both genetic diversity and breed identity, avoiding the overuse of any one dog, and making breeding decisions that protect the health, function, and long-term future of the entire population. Modern genetics is giving us the tools to do just that. Because purebred dogs offer something mixed-breed dogs often cannot provide to the same degree: predictability. When breeds are responsibly maintained, we can make more reliable expectations about adult size, energy level, temperament, behavior, structure, and working ability. That predictability helps families choose dogs that are better suited to their homes and lifestyles, and it allows working dogs to retain the specialized traits needed for jobs such as herding, hunting, guarding, sledding, detection, and assistance work. But there is a balance. Breeds can become too consistent, too predictable. That's the hidden cost of breeding dogs to fit an ideal. The goal isn't to maximize consistency at all costs or take the easiest paths to get there. It's to preserve the unique characteristics that define each breed while maintaining enough functional genetic diversity for that breed to remain healthy, resilient, and sustainable for generations to come. That is the challenge of modern genetic stewardship. And in our next episode, we'll explore how we can put these principles into practice. Because preserving a unique lineage isn't just about protecting its past, it's about protecting its future. And if that's important to you, subscribe to our channel and join us for our next episode.